Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. So today now we'll be doing chapter number 5, The Merchant of Venice of class 6th, which is written by William Shakespeare. So first of all, let us know about the characters used in the story. So the first one is Antonio. So Antonio was a young Venetian, the kindest man in the village. He was loved by everyone and he was so friendly. He was generous, he was Christian, and he lived in a lavish manner, which is luxurious. Now we'll read about Bassanio. Bassanio was good friend of Antonio, we can say best friend of Antonio, and Bassanio was a noble Venetian and a caring person. Shylock. Shylock was the enemy of Antonio and Bassanio. Shylock was a Jew, usurer, and was a very wealthy person. He was hard-hearted and disliked by everyone in the village. Now we'll read about Portia. Portia was a woman Bassanio was about to get married with. Portia was again very wealthy and was so intelligent. She lived in Belmont, a place near Venice. Now next is Grescenio. Grescenio was Bassanio's friend. Nerissa was Portia's waiting maid and was a clerk. Nerissa and Grescenio was about to get married. Now next is Valerio. Valerio was a counselor and he was Portia's relative. And the last one is Balthazar. Balthazar was the name because in the story we will know about that Portia became to clean a situation, she changes her way to doctor, and the name she put was Balthazar. So now we'll read about the story. So this story is about Venice. Now a young Venetian Antonio borrows money from a Jewish moneylender Shylock in order to help his friend Bassanio. The Jewish moneylender, who despises Antonio, agrees to lend the money but with a condition. So read on to the chapter how Shylock himself gets trapped in his own situation. So Shylock the Jew lived in Venice. He was a usurer and was very wealthy. He had amassed wealth by lending money at very high rates of interest to Christian merchants. He was a hard-hearted man and was disliked by all good persons, and particularly by Antonio, a young merchant of Venice. Shylock hated Antonio as much because he used to lend money to people when they were in trouble and would never take any interest for the money he lent. There was great enmity between this covetous Jew and the generous merchant, Antonio. Whenever Antonio met Shylock, he used to reproach him for his hard dealings. The Jew would tolerate his words with seeming patience while he secretly meditated revenge. Now we'll read about Antonio. Antonio was the kindest man that lived and was greatly loved by all his fellow citizens. But the friend who was the nearest and dearest to his heart was Bassanio, a noble Venetian. He had nearly spent all his fortune by living in a very lavish manner. Whenever Bassanio wanted money, Antonio assisted him and seemed it as if they had but one heart and one purse between them. One day Bassanio came to Antonio and told him that he wished to marry a lady and whose father that had left her a large estate, but he had no money to furnish himself suitably to marry such a rich heiress. So he asked Antonio to lend him 3,000 ducats. So you have to learn that how many ducats does Bassanio ask from Antonio. So Bassanio asked 3,000 ducats. Ducats means the gold and silver coins from Antonio. Though Antonio had a large fortune, he had at this time no ready money to give Bassanio because he had invested all his money in trade. His ships carrying rich cargoes had gone abroad and they would take some time to get back to the port of Venice. But being very eager to provide his friend with the money he needed, he decided to borrow the money from Shylock upon the credit of those ships. Antonio and Bassanio went together to Shylock, and Antonio asked the Jew to lend him 3,000 ducats upon any interest he should require, to be paid out of the goods contained in his ships in the sea. The Jew now said, Signor Antonio, very often you have railed at me and I have borne it with a patient shrug. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Do you think I should lend you 3,000 ducats? Antonio replied, If you will lend me this money, lend it to me not as to a friend, but rather than lend me as to an enemy. And then Shylock, pretending to be kind, said he would lend him 3,000 ducats and take no interest for his money. Only Antonio should go with him to a lawyer and there sign in Mary to spot a bond, that if he did not repay the money by a certain day, he would forfeit a pound of flesh to be cut off from any part of his body that Shylock pleased. I will sign this bond, said Antonio. Bassanio grew angry when he heard this. He begged Antonio not to risk his life by signing the strange bond, but Antonio was perfectly sure he has no risk and cheerfully agreed to the penalty. The rich heiress that Bassanio wished to marry lived near Venice at a place called Belmont. Her name was Portia. As soon as the bond was signed and the money was taken, Bassanio left for Belmont attended by another friend by the name Gratiano. There he succeeded in winning the heart of Portia. He confessed to her that he had no fortune. She, who loved him for his worthy qualities, answered, Myself and what is mine is now yours. I give them with this ring, and she presented a ring to Bassanio. Bassanio was so overpowered with gratitude at a gracious manner that taking the ring, he vowed never to part with it. Gratiano and Nerissa, Portia's waiting maid, wished to be married at the same time as Bassanio and Portia. Their happiness was turned to complete sorrow at that moment by a messenger who brought a letter from Antonio. When Bassanio read Antonio's letter, he turned pale. Pale means nervous. He then told Portia of his borrowing the money from Antonio and of Antonio's procuring it from the Shylock the Jew, and of the bond by which Antonio had agreed to forfeit a pound of flesh if it was not repaid by a certain day. And then Bassanio read Antonio's letter, which read like this: Sweet Bassanio, my ships are all lost. My bond to the Jew is forfeited, and since in paying it, it is impossible I should leave. I wish to see you at my death. Portia then said she would be married to Bassanio before he set out, to give him a legal right to her money, and the same day they were married. Gratiano was also married to Nerissa, and Bassanio and Gratiano set out in a great haste for Venice, where Bassanio found Antonio in prison. The cruel Jew refused to accept the money that Bassanio offered, and a day was fixed to try this shocking case before the Duke of Venice. Duke means judge. Portia, meanwhile, began to think if she could by any means try and save the life of Bassanio's dear friend Antonio, and at once resolved to go herself to Venice and speak in Antonio's defense. So now Portia had a relation named Bellerio and was a counselor in the law. She wrote to him, and when the messenger returned, he brought letters of advice from Bellerio about how to handle the case. Portia dressed herself and her maid Nerissa in men's clothes and set out immediately. They arrived in Venice on the very day of the trial. The case was just going to be heard in the Senate house when Portia entered and presented a letter from Bellerio. The learned counselor wrote to the Duke saying he was sick and requested that the learned young Dr. Balthazar, so he called Portia, might be permitted to take his place. This the Duke granted, though he was quite surprised at the youthful appearance of the stranger. And now began this important trial. Portia looked around her, and she knew the merciless Jew, and she was seeing Bassanio, but he could not recognize her in the disguise. The importance of the arduous task that Portia had undertaken gave her the courage she needed. First of all, she addressed herself to Shylock and spoke so sweetly of the noble quality of mercy that would have softened any heart but the unfeeling Shylock's. She said that it was a double blessing. It blessed the person who was merciful and the person who received it. Shylock only answered her by desiring to have the penalty forfeited in the bond. Is he not able to pay the money? Asked Portia. Bassanio then offered the Jew the payment of the 3,000 ducats as many times over as he wanted. When Shylock did not want the money, Portia gravely answered that laws once established cannot be altered. Shylock hearing Portia say that the law cannot be changed, said, Daniel is come to judgment. Oh, wise young judge, how do I honor you? How much elder are you than your looks? Portia now wanted to look at the bond, and when she had read it, she said, by this bond the Jew can lawfully claim a pound of flesh to be cut off nearest Antonio's heart. Shylock at once started sharpening a long knife. Looking eagerly towards Antonio, Shylock said, come, are you ready? Wait a little, said Portia, there is something else. This bond here gives you no drop of blood. The words expressly are a pound of flesh. If in the cutting of the pound of flesh you shed up one drop of blood, your hands and goods will by the law belong to the state of Venice. Now as it was utterly impossible for Shylock to cut off the pound of flesh without shedding some of the Antonio's blood, this wise discovery of Portia that it was flesh and not blood that was named in the bond saved the life of Antonio, and Gratian exclaimed, a wise and upright judge. Shylock, finding himself defeated, said that he would take the money, and Bassanio, rejoicing at Antonio's unexpected deliverance, cried out, here is the money, but Portia stopped him, saying, Shylock has already refused the money. He can only have the penalty. Shylock now said that he was ready to accept the bare principle, but even this Portia refused him. He could take his pound of flesh or nothing. All was now lost for Shylock. He turned away angrily to leave the court, but there was something more that Portia had to say to him. You cannot leave so soon, Shylock, she said. The law has now a hold on you. Shylock, you have plotted against the life of a Christian and a citizen of Venice. According to the law of Venice, the punishment for this crime is death. Besides, half your goods and monies will go to the state of Venice and the other half to Antonio, against whose life you have plotted. The generous Antonio then said that he would give his share of Shylock's wealth if Shylock would sign a deed to hand it over at his death to his daughter and her husband. The Duke now released Antonio and dismissed the court. The Duke and his senators left the court. Senators means judges. Left the court, and Bassanio and Antonio asked Portia to accept the 3,000 ducats for help and skillful handling for the case. But Portia would not accept the money but asked for the ring which she had given Bassanio and which was upon his finger. Bassanio was sorrow-stricken that the counselor should ask him for the only thing he could not part with, but he had to part with it. And then the clerk Nerissa, who had also given Gratiano a ring, begged the ring, and Gratiano gave it to her. There was a squabble when the husbands reached home, but then Portia narrated how she had come to be Balthazar and Nerissa her clerk. And now was all well, particularly as Antonio received the news of the safe return of his ships. So here the story ends. Thank you so much. Hope you all liked it, and we'll be further coming with more videos. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.